I remember talking to a wrestler backstage, watching him go over his match. I asked him, "How do you remember all that?" He replied, "It's like playing a song," explaining that once you start a tune, the rest just follows you as you work your way to the end. A fitting comparison, to be sure. Even beyond this, wrestling and music do have some pretty surprisingly deep connections, especially when it comes to musical eras. The genres and the trends that pass through both the times and those who make a joyful noise are very apparent if you stop to pay attention to them, which is exactly what we're going to do in this episode. Because today, Dave knows music trends and wrestling. Paul Heyman once said that we needed wrestling's version of Nirvana. Now, he didn't mean that in the spiritual sense. He was talking about the band Nirvana and how ECW needed to be wrestling's equivalent, even though Mickey Rourke might not have felt the same way.
Then that Cobain had to come around and ruin it all.
But you know what? Let's just back things up a bit. Looking at wrestling in the 1970s, the NWA was king. And while there were still some pretty strong gimmicks here and there, for the most part, wrestling was presented as more of a legitimate sport rather than sports entertainment. And this is the era that those of a certain age will claim is how wrestling is supposed to be, and that it's professional wrestling at its purest and best possible form. Not surprisingly, you also hear the same when it comes to music. There are those who feel that classic rock and soul from the 70s is exactly what music is supposed to be. And of course there's also disco too, but that would be those strong gimmicks that we talked about. Now, I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of people who grew up with songs from this time period feel the very same way about professional wrestling and what it's become. Alright, you could just chalk this up to simply saying that people like what they knew when they were young and still establishing their opinions on the world, and they dislike things that don't adhere to that, even though the times, they are a-changing. But I think there's more to it than just being a case of the first one now will later be last. And to examine that, let's move on to the 1980s and start inching our way towards Paul E.'s original statement. The big signature of 80s music for many is the synthesizer, a piece of technology that has musical roots that date back well before a-ha's Take On Me, but is still most known for its breakout decade. And if you don't believe me about that, then allow me to point out the famous 80s synth hit song Cars by Gary Newman, which was actually released in the 1970s. It charted in the 80s, but was released in 1979. Now, reflecting that back to wrestling, while WWF does draw a lot of criticism for turning the industry into a cartoon parody of itself, let's not pretend like silly gimmicks was an idea that was invented by Vince McMahon. And further relating wrestling to the synthesizer, there is also another particular piece of previously existing technology that sculpted the 1980s time period: the television. When MTV hit the scene in 1981, video killed the radio star. Cause believe it or not, there was a time when some people would listen to wrestling matches over the radio. Yeah, I know, it sounds baffling to me too. And while TV had been around for decades showing both wrestling and music, in the 80s, things would change forever. Now, yes, there had been prior advents in TV to change both industries, from Elvis performing Hound Dog to Gorgeous George to TV transitioning into color and much, much more. But as big as these milestones were, there was definitely something different once music television entered American households. One thing was, for those of you who are familiar with video editing history, is that you probably know that some people just hate the attention span shortening frequent cuts that many attribute to music videos. Going back to old black and white films, you notice how shots stay on screen longer without cuts than they do now. Today, we're used to seeing shots change frenetically in our movies, which there are those who link this phenomenon with MTV. Being that a music video is a short film of only a few minutes, hanging on a single shot for 20 seconds does eat up a lot of its runtime. By cutting after just a few seconds, you get to show more shots, and you also get to keep people's attention by not allowing their eyes to rest for too long. This technique is also something that WWF employed into their own television content in a way that was very different than other promotions that came before them. And also, with MTV and big national exposure from the World Wrestling Federation, musicians and wrestlers were being seen more and by more people and on a much bigger stage. No longer could you be a radio star first and foremost or have stardom that was based solely on your skill. Now you had to be good looking and flashy and presented specifically for the camera. Bright neon spandex, long hair, larger than life personalities living the party boy lifestyle. Am I talking about musicians or am I talking about wrestlers? Well, that's exactly my point, because I'm talking about both. The glitz and the glam rock of the 80s took over traditional rock and roll music, and the showy gimmicks of WWF also took over wrestling too, catapulting the company to becoming the industry leader. But this is where Paul E. dangerously comes in. Heyman said that music was all about Poison and Motley Crue and Winger and all these hair bands, and then along came Nirvana, and bam! the whole industry changed. Paul E went on to equate wrestling to these hairbands and said that it was time to shake everything up. And as the fad of hairband wrestling was drawing to a close, Extreme Championship Wrestling would follow suit with music and the grunge revolution. ECW featured wrestlers who were gritty and ragged, wrestlers who would use foul language, wrestlers who would fight dirty, or all of the above, which was exactly the same appeal that grunge music had. Just as you didn't need teased hair and guy liner to be a musician, you also didn't need a lot of complex guitar playing either. Ask anyone who could play one and they'll tell you that Nirvana songs are fairly easy to learn. All you needed was access to minimalistic equipment and hardcore dedication to your craft in order to become a musician. And that's all you really should need. So when we look at ECW and we see talents like Mikey Whipwreck, Sabu, or Taz, these were stars that didn't necessarily fit the WWF mold of being a champion. But Heyman knew their potential and had no problem highlighting their greatness, which is something that he did for a whole plethora of wrestlers who put in the time and became more with Heyman than they ever could have been under McMahon. It didn't matter what you looked like and it didn't matter where you came from. Anybody with a drive has the right to become a professional wrestler, and Paul Heyman knew that better than most. ECW was the land of misfit toys. A place for outcasts? Yes, but it was also a place where outcasts could become heroes. Plus, don't think this trick was limited to just ECW. World Championship Wrestling also used this tactic to create one of their biggest acts, just with a different direction. Kevin Nash has mentioned that one of the coolest things going on at the time, the way they saw it, was rap. And looking back at the NWO with Scott Hall, Conan, Scott Steiner, and so on, we see a lot of elements like clothes and slang being borrowed from the hip-hop community. A successful idea that also managed to make it outside of the New World Order as well. Now, looking at things today, yes, I will admit that the current music scene is a bit beyond my reach. However, as near as I can tell, I do see a disconnect between the coolest parts of music culture and wrestling. I don't know if maybe it's perhaps that music just isn't as cool as it used to be, or maybe I just don't get it anymore. But maybe the real issue is that WWE doesn't quite get it either. And maybe the problem that fans have with wrestling is that wrestling has lost the music. And maybe it's time yet again for another wrestling Nirvana. But what do you think? How else do you see music connecting with professional wrestling? Let me know down in the comments. And don't forget to help this channel out by subscribing and giving this video a big thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, Dave knows.